you can kind of think about the single biggest challenge or opportunity that, from your perspective, should be a focus of the Orthodox Church in America today, what would you say?
I want to begin by answering that question by quoting from my guru, Bishop Michael, who's currently teaching also at St. Tikhon Seminary. He has always said, you cannot give what you do not have. We have to ask ourselves, when it comes to the Orthodox faith, when it comes to our life, what do we really have? If we have the Christian faith as a supplement, as opposed to something that is essential, we really do not have anything in our lives. It's Christ that makes our life rich, and having Him as a supplement won't cut it in this world. Having Him as an essential, I would say, is important, and I think making that a priority will redefine Christianity in a world in which Christianity is associated with the word hypocrisy. We live in a world in which, when you think about Christians or Christianity, you walk on the street and you ask people about, hey, what do you think about Christianity? They will say, oh, hypocrisy, hypocrites. You don't really see Christians. I forget who was the one who said, I like Jesus, but I don't like Christians. You're right? So similarly, I think we have to ask ourselves, can the world look at us and say, I see Christ? And I think making that a priority, I think, is important. So I would say that's one thing that we all have to reflect on our own lives, even before we go from the family or the parish or what we do in the world. I think in our own life we have to ask, is that a priority?
Abuna's orders. I think one of the big challenges and opportunities, it's related, that of culture. It's not something that's new for most of us to be thinking about, but I want to encourage us to think about it in a different way. Oftentimes we see culture as standing in opposition or in addition to even our faith. And that's a particularly messy thing for us, especially in America, because we're trying to preserve our culture through the church, but we're also especially trying to preserve our faith and live our faith, even more than preserve it, live it. But I want to attack it from a slightly different perspective, because we're here in America. We're not in our home countries anymore, obviously, but this is our home. So how can we look at our faith and our culture slightly differently? Instead of standing in opposition to, perhaps we could see them as just being one, right? And what do I mean by that? For Armenians in the 5th century, we had this battle of Avarayr, which was against the Persian Empire, who was trying to convert the Armenians back to Zoroastrianism. And the Armenians said, no way, that is impossible. It is not possible for us to shed our skin any more than it is for us to shed our faith. Our faith and our skin, our faith is what makes us Armenian. But if we look at our faiths as not standing in opposition to our culture, again, let's stop looking at things as in conflict and working toward the same thing. If our culture is leading us to Christ, is leading us to Jesus, it can take on a whole different vibe to it. So I encourage us to think about how our culture and our faith really go together. What makes you a Copt is your faith. What makes an Armenian is our faith as Christians. And Armenians have a hard time with this because, well, we have our own country. We're not persecuted, and neither were we persecuted here, most of us, at least not in the same way we might have been persecuted in our countries before or in the lands that we had lived in before. But without that persecution against our culture, against our faith, how can this be just a part of our one identity?
I was going to say the same thing.
You and me go first.
Well, so I guess I'll take a different one then. I think the opportunity that culture is a big one. I think hopefully we'll come back to that. I think like when I look around me, I see a lot of brokenness. I see a lot of hurt. I see a lot of woundedness. And some of that comes from the Christian history, the Christian experience over the last several hundred years. that this nation has experienced. And it's not all been bad. A lot of it's been good. But I think we have an opportunity to become part of that story. And I think our story, our approach to that story is a little bit different. And I'm just thinking, again, that idea of the authority of mercy from the baptism. I think when you think about the work of Christ, it was an act of mercy. In our liturgy, we speak about mercy. And we ask the Lord to have mercy upon us throughout, beginning to end. And the work that Christ did were acts of mercy upon us, right? He saw us naked, he clothed us with himself. He saw us homeless, he prepared a place in heaven for us. He found us hungry, and he did an act of mercy. He fed us with the bread of life. And so I think for the church, in a sense, to pay that forward and to extend mercy, and that same kind of mercy to a broken, hurting, naked, hungry, homeless world around us, I think that's a great opportunity for us to really speak into the dialogue, but not just from a place with words, but through our lives as a living gospel.
There are several questions about unity, and perhaps not just unity from the top, but unity from on our front in terms of how we can be united in service, and like you're saying, Father Michael, for the community and around us. So what are your thoughts on, if it's taking some time for us to see the absolute communion kind of from the top, what are some things that we can do when we think about how we can be united with one another, showing that mercy to our community, just where we live? We're here in Brooklyn or we're here in New York. Some thoughts on that?
I think, first of all, one of the great things is that we are, like those of us in this room, most of us are able to experience that union in a way that we desire it. I encourage members of my parish on a regular basis to go and experience an Armenian liturgy and to commune, and the same with an Indian or Syrian or Ethiopian or Eritrean. Like, I encourage them, go and share with our brothers and sisters and come back and see the differences, because that'll tell you something about your uniqueness, your particularity. And so I think when we talk about unity, it's important to not say we all have to become the same, because our differences in some respect are really helpful. We see the world a little bit differently, and that helps. We have some different history and historical experiences, and so that helps. And so I think when we come together, it's not to say, and listen, there are some of us in this room that we don't have that experience, and it's my prayer, and I pray for that every day, that we would be able to really have that union that we're speaking about, and that I think many of us do desire, with the apex of it being able to share in the Eucharist. But I think when we come together, we learn from each other's experiences, and we can encourage and inspire one another. And so when I speak with my fathers, my brothers, my sisters, I learn personally from the experiences of others what's working, what they're even doing. And I think that almost serves as a mirror for each of our respective traditions, parishes, our own lives, on what we could do differently, what we could do more of, and how we might need to shift in certain ways so that we keep Christ as the focus. And it never becomes about what it shouldn't be. So I think we have an opportunity to hold one another accountable and to encourage each other.
I remember doing a midnight run with the parish in White Plains. And there was a guy that came that I'd never seen before at church and never heard of, but he showed up for this midnight run, and I was just completely blown away. We have so much that is covered, at least in the Armenian Church and in your traditions as well, perhaps by language in the liturgy. And this removes a lot of youth from the tradition, from accessing what it is that the Orthodox Church has to offer. But he felt a call to service. And perhaps that can be the way in which we can bring people into our own communities. And going back to my plea to you all, if you know an Armenian at church, or at your work, at your school, you may not invite them to church. They may not care to come to your church. They may not care to even come to the Armenian church. But these may be people like the guy I just mentioned about the midnight run, where they're interested in acts of service toward others. And this can be the way that they can live the gospel message without necessarily needing to overcome this hurdle of the language and the culture and all of this old stuff. So.
When we talk about unity among churches, I think it's important for us to see one another as assets to one another. Oftentimes, we begin to assess and differentiate one another through the lens of culture, and when we do that, it's difficult to see and assess one another through the lens of Christ. What unites us is not the food, is not the clothing, it's not the culture, it's Christ. When that realization, that radical, charismatic realization comes, it was present among the apostles. When that realization comes into our lives, we begin to do basic things in the world that creates lasting difference in the world. Just as an example, as a suggestion, if we can all come together here in Brooklyn and identify one need in the community. There's so many needs in the community. Let's identify one need in the community and work together towards fulfilling that need. When we begin to do that, we begin to bring the kingdom of heaven to that world. And the more we begin to do that, and if we all work together towards finding a need and working together towards fulfilling that need, the kingdom of heaven is on earth.
There are some questions referring to Deacon Ryan's quotes in the lecture regarding this idea that our things are not our own, right? What we have are not really just for us. So the question is really, how do you balance that? Even if you're bringing it up here in New York, this sounds, I think the person said Marxist or communist or things that are not democratic, right? How do you practically implement that in a sense that if you look around for us as young professionals, there's a significant amount of wealth among here where we would be considered, I think, among the top 1% of the world. Whether or not we feel that, we're not the 1% in America, but definitely 1% in the world. So what are ways that we can personally implement this and really kind of enact this idea that what I have is not really my own?
First, I'd like to challenge the notion of Jesus as a communist. I was actually using, from Father David Kirk, who I mentioned as the founder of Emmaus House, I was using his book, Quotations from Chairman Jesus. And it's this nice red book with this imprint, almost like Che Guevara, of Jesus on the front. Jesus as a communist. And this is an anachronism, right? We're reading back into Jesus something that Marx came up with 1,800 years later, even more. So what Jesus was saying was, and what the disciples did in the early church was they did hold everything in common. And we're not in a culture, we're not in a country where this is even possible. In monastic communities, sure, this can be a thing, but not in the way that we live our lives today. So absolutely there is a tension there between the culture in which we are steeped, the economy in which we're steeped, not the political, and not in the political sense, right? Economics and politics, let's separate those out. So we can have a democracy with communism too, okay? They're not mutually exclusive. But going back to the sort of sense of communality and what we can do when we're not monastics, when we're not living in the early church in these communities. I'll defer to St. Basil the Great again. He talks about, again, on social justice, you can read this, tearing down the store yards. Anyway, he says that he talks about the excess that we have. Right? What do you have and what do you need? If you have more than you need, that extra stuff, that's what he says isn't yours. What we need, sure, we can keep that, okay? We all need shelter. We all need clothes. We all need these sorts of things. We may need a car to get ourselves to work. We have all of these needs, right? But do we need 2 or 3 or 4 cars, right? It's more about what is excessive in our lives and what can we pare down. The more wealth that we have, the more that disparity that exists between what we have and what we need. And it's a challenge, and this is why Jesus said it's not impossible, but it's terribly difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. How hard is it? It's a lot easier for you to have less, because what you have is having less, that disparity is smaller. So if we take a look at what we have in our lives that's extra, maybe I don't need that extra $20 in my pocket today. Maybe somebody else could use that more. St. Basil says that excess that you have belongs to the poor. It doesn't belong to you. We do need certain things, and I grant that. I'm not saying, Jesus said, sell all your possessions, give it to the poor, come and follow me. And that's an incredibly difficult mandate living in this world today. But to maybe find a balance of that. I'm not going against Jesus. I don't want you to read that into what I'm saying. But to temper that a little bit in our daily lives and reduce the excesses in our lives to what is closer to what is necessary than perhaps we live. And we all, and myself is the first among that included, we can all do a little bit better in that. So,
I'm reminded of Scripture, particularly the book of Genesis, where God commands Adam and Eve to till the garden, to take care of the garden, not to exploit, not to do whatever that you want. Now that I've given you the garden, the whole universe, it's yours. Do whatever that you want with it. He says to till. The commandment was very, very, very specific. We have to ask ourselves, looking at our own lives, are we tilling and taking care of the garden? Or are we exploiting the garden? And when I say the garden, I'm talking about the world in which that we live in. We believe more lies in our lives than truth. And one among many lies that the demons have been successful in making us believe is, you need fill in the blanks. If you were to really make an inventory in your lives of what you really have and what you really need, guaranteed more than half of the stuff that you have in your life you don't need. And guaranteed all the half of stuff that you do not need, somebody's begging for it. Somebody's necessity, basic necessity it is. Right? So, yes, we want to do great things in the world. But I would like to quote Dr. Jordan Peterson by saying, yes, that's wonderful that you want to solve world poverty. That's great that you want to go out there and change the world. Before that, clean up your room. Let's fix our own room first. And let's live out the Gospels for what it is fully before we go out to the world, so we can be unconditionally giving to the world. And it begins very small. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be something great in the sense where, oh, now that I've gone to the Ark and I'm empowered, I have to go and empty out my bank and give to the poor, to everyone. That's not the idea. Well, there are certain injustices that are taking place in your life that we continue to take place in our life through avarice, through pride, through greed. Let's stop that. Let's take it small so we can make lasting changes in the world.
If we're saying that orthodoxy is alive, then I challenge you, like I think solution-wise or end goal-wise, I think we could probably collectively agree on what we think is good and what's not good, right? I mean, and for most of us, we look to the scriptures and to the Christian tradition through the last 2,000 years. We say, there's a really good image of what we ought to be doing as a church. What gets me, what surprises me, is then the church looks and says, but the government should be doing this, or the state should be doing this. And I think that's probably where we come up short, is we think we've bought into this insanity here in this country, okay? And I'm an American, made in the USA, born and raised, love this country. But we've bought into this insanity that the government or the state is supposed to fix everything. Guys, the church is the hope of the world. Christ in his church is the hope of the world. So I think part of our problem is we keep sitting around, looking around, seeing this massive problem around us, and we don't know where to begin, and I think where we begin, I know where we begin, is right in front of us. So rather than looking down to D.C. or the capitals in your state, you are, Christ in you, the hope that the people around you need. And they need to experience Christ in our lives.
So if we were to begin to do some of these things, if we were to believe this is the golden age of Orthodoxy, and we're inspired, and we're thinking that we're going to do the things, all the things, what is the vision? What would the church, what would this city look like in 50 years, if we really did all the things that we really believed, and we hear about, and we're taught, and we live in our liturgical life? So a thought on kind of the inspiration and the vision of the future.
I do not have the gift of prophecy or future telling. However, I think it would be extremely prideful of me to say, if we can all get our act together and we can somehow fix up the world in 50 years in Brooklyn, this is what it looks like. I think it would be extremely prideful to say that. But in an attempt of working out the Gospels in our life as a community, I could say perhaps one small change through the grace of God and the Holy Spirit that we can achieve is love. There's so much hatred. There's so much hatred, not only of those who we know, but those who we do not know. What reason do we have to hate those strangers who we do not know who are different from us? I think if anything, if we can have any criteria that can be placed upon whether or not we're doing the right thing when it comes to living out the Orthodox life, is whether or not we're able to love one another unconditionally.
I think there are some institutional things that would change, right? As Abuna Michael just said, we look to the government to fix these problems of poverty and for health care and these sorts of things. And this is another arena in which I think the church could be a very powerful element in changing our communities. What if we started having hospitals and provided health care? There are clinics that some parishes have. What if this were imagined even at a larger scale? Having those houses of hospitality for the poor. Why not the elderly? The nursing home situation in this country is it's pathetic. It's heart-wrenching. If any of you have been to a nursing home recently or work in one, it's just awful. Imagining yourself as a person up in your years being treated not as a human being, even, being abused. This happens all over. It's a pervasive problem. If the church were doing this work, I hope to God, that we wouldn't be doing the same things to these residents. So if we take a step back and stop looking to the government and society at large to be taking care of these problems, and we take them back on ourselves where it belongs, in our faith communities, and as a witness to the larger community, things would change institutionally. And love is a very powerful idea that Jesus commanded us to spread, the love. That this is, I love the first epistle of John for this reason and his focus. Let us not love in word or tongue, but in action and in truth. We talk a lot about love, but what does it look like in action and in truth if it's not doing these things, a la James, for other people? So love can have this sort of fuzzy quality, and it feels good, and it's nice to say I love you and to spread the love and this kind of thing, but maybe we can even dial it back a little bit and think in terms of kindness, somebody hurts us, how do we respond? Do we respond in love? Do we respond with kindness? We're frustrated with somebody. Maybe we work with them and they just irritate the heck out of us. Do we respond with kindness? Do we embody kindness? We can embody love. That's fuzzy. That's huge. That's hard. Let's start with kindness, compassion, trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And if we start to do that, we can model that for other people, both as a community as well as on the individual level.
So I think I tend to think of this in two forms. One is what we do inside and what we do outside. And I think both of them have to have a shared vision, and they need to almost like work together as hand in glove. And so I would echo the words that Deacon Ryan and Father Abraham spoke about what we can do outside. I think what we need to do inside is not easy work, and it requires sacrifice. I'll tell y'all when the new, it's no longer new, I guess we're 6 years old now, the parish I serve at now in Monroe, New Jersey, St. Yanis. When we started, there was like a lot of confusion, and it was like mostly centered around culture and language. But as a Protestant buddy of mine said to me a few years ago, you guys have to be sure you're giving Orthodox Christianity, not Egyptianity. And I think that's the cross, guys. Like, I want my kids to know Arabic. I do. My wife and I, we try to speak Arabic to them at home. Okay? We want to give them culture, but I believe that's not the role of the church, is not to communicate culture of a different nation. It's to take the gospel message and find the positive aspects of the new host culture, take some of the beautiful aspects that are kind of confused with the new culture, and that can speak into that new culture and present the gospel. And what that requires is cross, it's sacrifice. I was just speaking with one of the brothers during lunch, and we were both like agreeing, like we love our culture and language and all that stuff. If we're really talking about doing the work of the gospel in this country and sharing Christ with our neighbor in this country, then that requires the cross. And believe you me, the cross, like Jesus wasn't doing cartwheels in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said, let this cup pass. Like, the cross is not exciting, guys, okay? But the cross leads to salvation. So I think we need to do some hard work inside and understand that there is some work that needs to be done outside, but if we believe salvation ultimately happens in the church, that yes, we want to do social justice and social work outside, but ultimately we want to embrace people into the body of Christ so that they would experience the very life of Christ in our respective parishes. So, but it requires the cross, all right?